You've seen this knife before. Maybe not this exact one, but one like it. Bottom drawer of a dresser, under the folded handkerchiefs. Bottom of a toolbox in the garage, under 40 years of loose bolts. The blade is narrower than it should be. Somebody sharpened it 1,000 times, and the steel gave up a little every time. The leather handle has gone almost black. The sheath has a row of stitching that doesn't match the factory stitching, because at some point the old thread rotted, and somebody sat down at a kitchen table and fixed it. In your family, that knife has a name, Grandpa's old hunting knife. And then one afternoon somebody tilts it toward the window and actually reads what's stamped down by the guard. USN Mark II, Cattaraugus 225Q, RH35 LC14B. 40 years before that blade ever cut baling twine in a barn, it was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere with a very different climate and a very different job description. But here's the thing that catches people off guard. For a lot of these knives, the war may not have been the hardest part of their working life. The war lasted 4 years. What came after lasted decades. Deer seasons, fishing trips, feed sacks, fence wire, ice chests, truck glove boxes, kitchen counters at 4 in the morning before a hunt, 100 sharpenings, 2 handles, 3 sheaths. Today we're going to walk through 12 of them. 12 knives that went to war, came home, and then went right back to work like nothing had happened. And by the end, I think you'll understand something that changes how a worn old blade looks in your hand. Because the generation that owned these knives would have found our word for them, collectible, a little bit strange. They didn't have a word for it. They just had a knife. Number 12. The Navy rigging knife. We start with the one nobody puts on a wall. Sheepfoot blade, blunt at the tip on purpose. A steel spike that folds out of the other end. A bail on the butt for a lanyard, because you're going to be up somewhere and you're going to drop it. That spike isn't a weapon. It's a marlin spike, a tool for prying a rope's strands apart so you can splice them back together. Everything about this knife is about line. Cutting it, splicing it, working knots that have swollen tight with salt water. Now think about what a sailor does the week he gets home in 1946. He gets near water again, and the job barely changes. Rope is still rope, knots still swell. A boat cleat in Rhode Island doesn't care that the ocean is a different ocean. The rigging knife didn't need a second career. It just needed a smaller boat. Number 11. The TL29 lineman's knife. 2 blades, one that cuts, one that doesn't. The second one is a flat screwdriver with a notch filed in it for stripping insulation off wire. The name is not romantic. It stands for tool lineman. 29 is just a number on a list. And here's the first surprise of the day. This is not really a World War II knife. The Army had written a specification for it back around 1919. It went to war because it was already there, sitting in the supply system, doing wire work for the Signal Corps, for engineers, for anybody who had to make electricity go somewhere it wasn't going yet. Now, I want to be straight with you about something, because it matters if you have one. Most TL29s sitting in American toolboxes today are not wartime knives. The government kept buying them for decades after 1945. If yours has plastic handle scales and steel bolsters, you're probably holding a Cold War knife, not a Pacific one. The earlier ones tend toward wood scales and brass. The oldest ones of all, from before the TL29 name settled in, carry a Signal Corps, marking on the little shield set into the handle. But sit with that for a second, because it isn't bad news. It's the proof. A design doesn't stay in production for 50 years unless it was right. And the reason a returning veteran kept using his Asian is exactly the reason the Army kept ordering them. Number 10. The Camillus No. 5665 hunting knife. This one was in a catalog before it was in a war. Camillus listed it as a hunting knife. 5-inch blade. Nothing tactical about it at all. In April of 1942, 1,000 of them went to Quantico to be issued to the 1st Raider Battalion, because the Marines needed sheath knives immediately, and the only way to get sheath knives immediately was to go buy the ones that already existed. Large numbers of the same pattern went into Army Air Corps emergency survival kits. The raiders, for the record, were not thrilled. It was better than what they had. It was not what they wanted. But think about where that knife ends up in 1947. A man who used it to cut rations and cord in the Pacific gets home, and in November he takes it out to a deer stand. For this one, coming home wasn't retirement. It was going back to its old job. Number 9. The PAL RH35, also known as the USN Mark I. Around 1940, the PAL Blade Company bought Remington's cutlery division, the machines, the patterns, the leftover parts, all of it. That's why the model numbers on PAL fixed blades start with those two letters, RH, Remington Hunter. So look at what's actually stamped on this knife. One side says RH PAL 35, turn it over, and the other side says USN Mark I, a hunting knife designation and a Navy designation, on the same blade, an inch apart. That's not a contradiction. That's the whole story of this list, in 6 characters. And it's exactly why so many families never suspect a thing. Grandpa's knife looks like a hunting knife, because, in every way that matters to a man skinning a deer, it is one. Number 8. The Western L77. Now here's one I'm not going to oversell. The L77 was a long, slim Western knife bought early in the war for the raiders, because it looked more like a fighting knife than the hunting knives they'd been handed. 7-inch blade, 11 inches overall. It was built for the civilian market, and it was not built for what they did with it. The record on this one is honest and a little unkind. The L77 had a real tendency to break, and yet it went overseas anyway, in numbers, and it did more combat duty than anybody planned for it to do. Which raises the question I want you holding for the rest of this video. The L77s that came home because they were sporting knives to begin with. They fit a life that was waiting for them. The ones that didn't come home mostly didn't come home because we asked a deer knife to be a pry bar. Same steel, 2 completely different verdicts. Number 7. The Western G46-6, the Shark. This is the one that proves the thesis on paper, so I want to slow down. The Shark, 6-inch fullered blade, stacked leather, red and black spacers, and that distinctive Western pommel. During the war, there were government contracts with the Army Air Forces and with the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics, and on top of that, a whole lot of servicemen simply bought one themselves before shipping out. Now pick one up and look at the ricasso, the flat part of the blade, right in front of the guard. There's a patent number stamped there. That patent has nothing to do with the war. It was applied for in December of 1931 and granted in the summer of 1934, and it covers a way of splitting the tang in 2 so a stacked leather handle sits more securely. A Boulder, Colorado cutlery family invented it in the middle of the Great Depression to make better hunting knives for ranchers and elk hunters. So on a blade that crossed the Pacific, there is a Depression-era hunting knife patent riding along, stamped right into the steel. And then the war ends, and Western keeps making the knife. In the mid-50s, the company simply changed the letter in the model number. G46 became L46. Same pattern, same handle, same profile, now sold to men buying a knife for elk season, instead of men shipping out. That's the part I find remarkable. We usually say, a design survived the war. This one didn't survive the war. It just went back to what it had always been. Let's stop the count for a moment. A mint knife can tell you one thing very well. It can tell you exactly how it looked the day it left the factory. That's genuinely worth something. But a worn knife is telling you about the next 40 years. And most of us were never taught how to read that. The most famous knife on this list is still ahead. But fame isn't what made these blades last. Keep an eye on what each one was actually designed to do. Because that, and not the battles, is what decided which knives got a second life. Number 6. The Case 337-6Q. If you set this next to a Cattaraugus 225Q on a table, most people could not tell you which is which. Same 6-inch heavy blade, same stacked leather, Same general attitude, which is, nobody designed this thing to be delicate. There's one tell, and it's at the butt end. The pommel on the case is a single thick slab of steel. The pommel on the Cattaraugus is 3 plates riveted together. You can see the seams if you catch the light right. Nothing else in American military cutlery looks quite like that. Both were heavy general-purpose knives. Neither was elegant. Both were, frankly, overbuilt. And overbuilt is exactly what a man wants on a farm. Picture the work waiting for that blade in 1953. Not a beachhead, a hay bale, a crate of nails, a frozen length of rope. A hog to be dressed out behind the barn in November. Nobody buys a second knife for that when there's already one in the truck. Number 5. The Collins number 18, the Gung Ho knife. This one is barely a knife. It's a short machete, 9.5-inch blade, 14 inches overall, wide and heavy toward the tip, so it swings like a hatchet. And it did not start with the Marines. The Collins number 18 was already in Army Air Corps survival kits as early as 1934, 8 years before it ever got famous. What happened in 1942 was that Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson of the 2nd Raider Battalion decided it was the right tool for jungle work, and his executive officer, Major James Roosevelt, the president's son, helped get 1,000 of them out of Collins. The Raiders called it the Gung Ho knife, after a phrase Carlson had picked up in China, work together. Now, a correction, because this one has been repeated for decades, and it's worth getting right. You will constantly see the Collins number 18 called a V44. That is not correct. The actual V44 was a machete made by W.R. Case & Sons in 1944, 2 years after the Raiders got their Collins knives. The names simply drifted together over the years, until nobody remembered they'd started apart. And here is the part that stays with me. A history of the Raiders made a quiet observation about the knives those men brought home. Some of them, years later, were still being used for garden digging, and in many cases those knives had become worth more than the samurai swords their owners had carried back from the Pacific. Nobody told them. They just needed something to dig with, and there it was, hanging in the shed. Which brings me to the thing I most want you to take away today, and it isn't sentimental. It's practical. Not every scar on an old knife is history. 40 years of honest sharpening is a record. You can read it. A blade ground narrow and swept back toward the handle tells you a man used the belly of that knife constantly, which is what you do skinning game. A rounded, battered pommel tells you it got used as a hammer. Hand stitching on a sheath tells you somebody refused to throw it away in about 1961. All of that is evidence. All of it is worth keeping. But a blade taken to a power buffer in 1998 is not evidence of anything. That's not wear. That's erasure. Because the stamp that identifies the maker, the one thing that could tell you whether this is a wartime knife or a hardware store knife, lives on the thinnest, shallowest part of the blade. 2 minutes on a wheel and it's gone forever. And once it's gone, nobody on earth can put it back. So the rule I'd offer you is simple. Where that happened while the knife was working is part of the story. Anything done later to make it look newer usually takes the story away. Some wear records history. Some cleaning destroys it. Number 4. The Woodman's Pal, the LC14B. This one belongs on this list more than almost anything else, and most people have never heard of it. Picture a machete that got into an argument with a hatchet and a sickle, and they settled it. 12-inch blade, blackened. A sharpened hook curling off the end for catching vines. Stacked leather handle, a steel knuckle guard wrapped over the top. It was designed and patented in 1941 by a Swiss-born engineer named Frederick Ursum, who was running the Victor Tool Company in Reading, Pennsylvania. And he designed it for civilians, foresters, orchardmen, farmers clearing fence lines. The whole idea was that a man shouldn't have to carry 3 tools to do one job. Then the Army found it. It got the designation Knife LC14B, went first to the Signal Corps for cutting communication lines through heavy growth, and ended up in the Pacific. It came with a canvas sheath, a sharpening stone, and a small booklet the inventor wrote himself, telling you how to use it. Now here's the payoff. And it's not a story. It's a fact. You can verify this afternoon. That tool is still being made. Same town in Pennsylvania, same specification. You can buy a brand new one today and hold it next to a 1944 example, and it is recognizably the same object. 80-some years. Never stopped. The war didn't define the woodman's pal. The war interrupted it, and it went straight back to clearing brush like nothing happened. Number 3. The PAL RH36. 6-inch clip point, stacked leather, flat guard. If I showed you this blade with no context, you'd say hunting knife, and you'd be right, and you'd also be missing about half of it. The RH36 descends directly from a Remington design, the old Model 36, and researchers have traced that shape further back still, to a classic American sporting pattern that had been around since well before either World War. When PAL bought Remington's cutlery operation, they kept building it on the same machines and renamed it. Then war broke out, and the government needed fixed blades in quantity, and it turned out that America already had exactly the right factories running. They were just making them for deer hunters. One honest caution if you have one. PAL kept selling bright-finished RH36s after the war, as ordinary hunting knives, so a bright, clean RH36 is not automatically a wartime knife. The darker Parkerized finish is generally the wartime one, but with a knife that's been carried for 50 years, finish is often the first thing gone. Which is the real reason these hide in plain sight. Wear isn't always neglect. Sometimes it's biography, and biography is hard to date. Number 2. The Cattaraugus 225Q. Pick one up, and the first thing you notice is that nobody designed this thing to be delicate. 6 inches of blade, and thick, genuinely thick, several times the steel of a proper fighting knife, stacked leather grip, and that 3-plate riveted pommel we talked about. Now, this knife comes wrapped in 2 competing stories, and both of them are wrong. Story 1. It's the quartermaster crate opening knife. The Q stands for quartermaster, so obviously the Army bought a knife to open boxes with. Which never made sense, because the Army had crowbars. Story 2, and this one came from Cattaraugus' own wartime magazine advertising, is that it's a Marine commando knife. It was not. That was ad copy. Here's what the paperwork actually says. A researcher working in the National Archives found a wartime bill of material for these knives, and the nomenclature on that document, in the Army's own words, is Special Hunting Knives, 6-inch. Hunting knives. That's what the Army called them, on the paper that ordered them. And the president of Cattaraugus, interviewed by a newspaper in the spring of 1945, described what men were doing with them in language that's almost cheerfully practical. Opening boxes, driving nails, opening coconuts, digging foxholes. So the honest answer isn't the crate myth or the commando myth. It's that this was a deliberately overbuilt general-purpose knife, and the men who carried it used it for absolutely everything, exactly as expected. Which tells you precisely what happened to it after 1945. Nothing changed. The boxes became feed sacks. The foxholes became fence post holes. And that's why you find so many of these with the blade worn visibly narrow. A collector looks at that and sees missing steel. I'd put it differently. The steel a collector wishes was still on that blade is the steel its owner spent 30 years using. And number 1. The 1219C2. The knife everybody calls the K-bar, and the Navy called the Mark II. But not for the reason you're expecting. And I'm not going to give you a history lecture you've already heard. Every single knife we've talked about so far started somewhere in civilian life. Catalogs, hunting camps, hardware stores, forestry work. This one didn't. The knife, fighting utility, 1219C2, was approved in November of 1942, based on a design submitted to the Marine Corps by the Union Cutlery Company, a design that had not been made for the civilian market. It was drawn for the war. Roughly 966,000 of them were made before it was over, by Union Cutlery, by Camillus, by PAL, by Robeson. The Navy adopted an essentially identical knife as the Mark II. Quick note, because it saves people embarrassment. K-bar was Union Cutlery's trademark. The first shipment to the Pacific happened to be Union Cutlery knives. The name stuck to the whole pattern, and now everybody calls all of them K-bars. So K-bar stamped in a man's memory does not tell you who made the knife in his drawer. The Tang stamp does. Now, the answer to why this one lasted has been sitting in its official name the entire time. Fighting / utility. Somebody in 1942 wrote that down on purpose. They did not order a dagger. They ordered a knife that had to fight and had to cut rope, open cans, split kindling, dig, pry, and generally do whatever a tired man needed done at 2 in the morning. And a knife designed for that has no adjusting to do when the uniform comes off. Cutting rope on a beachhead and cutting rope in a hay barn are the same motion. Here's the proof, and it's the strongest one on this list. The pattern went out of production after the war, and then in 1961, the military put it back into production. It is still issued. It is still one of the most bought knives in the base exchange. 80 years on, and the design has not needed replacing. A pristine one tells you exactly how it looked leaving the factory in 1944. But a knife, with the blade worn thin, a replacement handle, a homemade sheath, and 2 initials scratched into the guard, that one is telling you what happened after the factory. After the Pacific, after the uniform came off, and the man put on work clothes, and went back to a job that needed doing for the next 40 years. I want to leave you with how that generation actually thought, because I believe we've lost it a little. They didn't call it a collectible. They called it a knife. If it got dull, they sharpened it. If the sheath split, they stitched it. If the handle went loose, they tightened it, or made a new one out of whatever was in the shop. If the point snapped off, they put it to the wheel and ground a new point, and it was shorter now, and that was fine. And I want to be careful here, because this part gets romanticized and it shouldn't be. Not every man was permitted to keep what he was issued. These knives came home a dozen different ways. Private purchase before shipping out, the exchange counter, and above all the enormous government surplus sell-off that started in 1946, when every town in America seemed to get an Army-Navy store. If you can't prove which road your knife took, you can't prove it. Say so. That's not a weakness in the story, because the story doesn't depend on it. One object can pass through pre-war America, through a war, onto a farm, through 30 deer seasons, into a garage, to a son, to a grandchild, and end up on a workbench in front of somebody who never met the man who carried it. By collector standards, that knife may be in terrible condition, but condition was never really the point. A knife that crossed an ocean, came home, worked through another generation, and still ended up in your hand, did not survive because somebody protected it from use. It survived because somebody kept finding a reason to use it. And if it's in your drawer tonight, that somebody was in your family. I'm Harlan Vance. This has been Lost American Arms.